It's time for another edition of Lewis at Large, 60 minutes of smart talk radio featuring guests from all walks of life in conversation with your host, Warner Lewis. So sit back and lend us your ears for the next hour. Now here with today's first guest is the host of Lewis at Large, Warner Lewis.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of Lewis at Large. Yours truly, Warner Lewis from the flight deck, and of course that means some extremely smart talk radios in your future. In this segment, I am extremely pleased to have Cristin O'Keefe with us. An exciting new work called Dr. Mutter's Marvels, and we will be talking to her about that. It is all about the dawn of modern medicine, an extraordinary story indeed. She is from the East Coast originally, but now lives in Austin, Texas, a very hip town. And many of you that listen to this show, I know, spend a lot of time down there, and we're trying to encourage her to come here as well. Anyway, Cristin, how are you, my friend?
Very good. Thanks so much for speaking with me, Warner.
Yeah. By the way, do I have the title right? Is it Dr. Mutter? Is it
That's a great question. We do know that he was born Thomas Mutter in Virginia in 1811, but when he went off to study surgery in Paris, he decided he was going to be the premier plastic surgeon of America and was going to come back and showcase this new field. And to add flash to his name, he added a umlaut to his name. Mm-hmm. And it's still debated at the Mutter Museum itself whether or not he additionally changed the pronunciation. Some people continue to call him Dr. Mutter, but I believe if you add an umlaut, you're going to change the pronunciation. Right, so I call him Dr. Mutter.
Dr. Mutter.
But no one knows for sure.
All right. Well, we'll interchange. Well, again, what are the two dots called? An umlaut? What is that?
Yes, an umlaut.
An umlaut. Again, the two dots above the U. Very well. Hey, by the way, also on setup for our guest here, she is a best-selling nonfiction writer and poet, having written for the New York Times, a lot of books on her own. The Onion's AV Club, very cool, NPR Science Fridays, and the UK newspaper The Guardian, amongst others. So anyway, a lot of credibility, a lot of fun, a lot of energy here. Well, let's do this. Let's give our Lewis at Large listeners a little bit more of a setup. Let's take us back. Again, the story, the 1800s, and medicine, very, very crude, even in these United States, correct?
Absolutely. Medicine back then was a bit of a wild, wild west. You didn't need a license to practice medicine. You didn't need a degree. You didn't even need to study medicine. You literally could just put doctor on a placard, hang it outside your house, and just start sticking leeches on people. It was also a time before germ theory was proven, so doctors didn't wash their hands or tools before any medical procedures. And it was a time, important in understanding Mutter, it was a time before ether anesthesia. So he was a surgeon who performed reconstructive surgeries on the severely deformed in a time when patients were awake during the surgeries.
Okay, Cristin, question for you. You talk about all these non-licensed sort of fake doctors running around the Wild West and all over, frankly. Was Dr. Mutter, was he in fact licensed, or was he, because I know ultimately he was very humanistic in his approach, but was he in fact licensed?
He received his medical degree from University of Pennsylvania, which was the first medical school ever started here in the United States, founded by our own Benjamin Franklin. And he became a professor in a medical institution, Jefferson Medical College. But in order to understand why he was such a humanist and why he had such a patient-centric philosophy towards medicine, which is definitely not how medicine was taught or practiced during his lifetime, was that he was a patient for most of his life. His entire family, his parents, grandparents, siblings, they all died before he turned to the age of 8. And he himself, even though his family was decimated by disease, he survived, but was very ill throughout his childhood and adolescence and young adulthood, and in fact would die at a very young age, at the age of 46. But Mutter, throughout his childhood met with doctors and I think understood what he would want out of a doctor-patient experience very clearly from those experiences. And he believed he should have been treated with clarity. He should have been, met with clean hands and tools and seen as a human being who is suffering and not a problem to be fixed or a disease to be cured, which is how medicine sort of treated its patients back then. So when he had an opportunity to teach He was given the chair of surgery at the premier Jefferson Medical College at the age of 31. Those are the philosophies that he most strongly espoused. I mean, he was an innovative surgeon doing work that no one else in the country was doing, but tied to that, he also talked about his patients as human beings, and that they deserve to be treated as such at a time when that was, definitely not how people in medicine viewed their patients, which is weird by today's standards, but very common back then.
You've written 6 books on poetry.
Yes.
Why suddenly about medicine, particularly as it's related to the brutalness, the leeches, the bleedings, the disfigurement surgeries, failed, et cetera, et cetera? Why this subject?
I was born and raised in Philadelphia, which is where the Mutter Museum, which is Mutter's, legacy, is based. The Mutter Museum is sort of an infamous cult museum. It's a science museum that showcases what we would call medical oddities, 19th century oddities, like women with horns growing from their heads, or rib cages deformed by corsets, or they have a 9-foot colon that was extracted from a human being on display. And in fact, you can go to the gift shop and buy a plushy version of their megacolon to take home with you, in case you're interested. And it was a rite of passage for all Philadelphia school children to visit this school, to visit this museum and sort of be shocked and awed by it. And I never realized how unusual it was until I left the city and people began asking, what's the deal with that museum? And I didn't have an answer for them. And it turns out really neither did the museum itself. They didn't know a lot of information about its founder. So when I was given the opportunity to earn a scholarship, I paid my own way through college, based for writing a story based on the life of a scientist or a scientific discovery. I thought maybe there is a story here. Maybe the story of how this bizarre museum came to life might yield me the scholarship money. And so I wrote the then director, the late, great Gretchen Wharton, and said, I know I'm not the usual person that you would allow into your medical archives. I was an undergraduate studying screenwriting. At the time, I was running a poetry slam out of the basement of CBGB's, the historic punk venue in New York City.
Whoa.
But I really am interested in this man and his story, and I would love to explore it more. And in the spirit of the Mutter Museum, they opened their doors to me and said, we would love to know more about him. Please come in. We will give you anything you need. And I walked into the archives 15 years ago this upcoming December. So it took 14 years from when I first walked into the museum to when the book came out in hardcover last fall. And so it was a very long journey, but to have the book, Dr. Mutter's Marvels, come out and have it be a New York Times bestseller for 3 months was so beyond my expectations.
Yeah.
But, it means so much that the story of Mutter resonated with so many people in the same way that it resonated with me as that undergraduate just stepping into the archive for the first time.
So you worked on this throughout your other professional dealings that you were doing, sort of off and on. Is that because research tough to find, or there were stories that would go one place and then they'd lead you another and another and another, and it just really took that long to put it all together?
Absolutely. The research was very difficult for this story. I mean, Mutter's story was really lost in history. And the way that I was able to dig it out was by going through sort of unusual primary sources, student journals, teacher minutes, rare biographies that you can only find if you go to specific archives, obviously letters and diaries that I pulled from that time period of people who knew Mutter. It was very difficult. So I needed to really leave my job and work on this full time in order to really do the book justice. And I didn't have the self-confidence, honestly, to think that I was the type of person who would be able to write this story until I had already published my first book of nonfiction, which was a history of the poetry slam movement in New York City, a contemporary history. Up until then, I thought, wow, this is an amazing story, but people like me don't get to write these stories, right? I was a screenwriting undergraduate, a poet by trade. This was a 19th century medical history. But no one else was telling me that, and that's something I like to talk to about other writers, or really anyone who wants to, explore an idea that's outside of their comfort zone. If you feel like, that you want to do something, but you're not the type of person who gets to do it, whether you think, I'm not educated enough, I'm not bright enough, I'm not young enough, I'm not attractive enough, ask yourself if you're the only one telling you that. Because frequently frequently it is just you. And other people are so interested in pushing you forward and having you achieve your dreams. And that was certainly the case with me. As soon as I said, you know what, this is something I want to do, the Mutter Museum came in behind me, and we applied for grants together and fellowships. And I got support not only from the museum itself, the College of Physicians of Philadelphia, but I got a year-long writing residency at the University of Pennsylvania and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, which all supported the writing of Dr. Mutter's marvels. And I think that you can tell, when you read the book, I'm a longtime reader and lover of nonfiction. I love really interesting stories that read like novels, but are filled with really interesting, true stories. And I tried to fill the book with all the sort of most delicious and strange and bizarre stories that are, that would make you want to stop and go, oh my God, listen to this. I can't believe this is true. And I hope that readers find the book as a joy to read as I did researching and writing it.
Well, let's dive back again towards your character, Dr. Mutter, Dr. Mutter, however you please, on this show. Here is a professional. He sees some of the sort of archaic and almost brutal methods of what at the time were considered modern surgery, whether it was real or improvised. Tell us, how was he able to affect change here?
He was in a position of power as the professor at Jefferson Medical College, which was one of the premier colleges in America. He influenced multiple generations of doctors, young men who would go on and become very important people in their field. And Mutter's philosophies were in contrast with other philosophies being taught at the same institution, most famously Charles D. Miggs, who was sort of the antagonist of Mutter, a real-life man whose ideological stances were in total contrast to Mutter's, where Mutter was very empathetic and patient-centric. This was the chair of obstetrics who taught his students, men who would go on to treat women, that women's heads were too small for intellect, but just the right size for love, and that men were their masters and lords. I mean, to teach that kind of contempt for your patient is shocking by today's standards, but he was the best-known and most respected obstetrician in his time. And you compare that to Mutter, who, would spend days and weeks meeting with patients and desensitizing their faces through surgery, prior to surgery, doing preoperative care, doing postoperative care, which wasn't done prior to Mutter. I mean, Mutter created what we now know as recovery rooms. Prior to that, if you got your surgery done at a surgical clinic, they would just stick you in a wagon and drive you home over the cobblestone streets of Philadelphia. And he thought this was barbaric and insisted that rooms be created so that his patients could recover. And his own home institution denied him it. They just didn't understand why it was necessary. So he took it upon himself to rent out a floor above a local restaurant. And once he was done with his surgeries, he would move his patients there so that he could keep his eye on them and make sure that they healed in the way that he believed they should be, their progress should be made, keeping their wounds clean and keeping them fed with the best food. And that was all absolutely, against the grain of what contemporary medicine was like. And at first, some of his students were shocked by him and preferred, the older school theories of medicine as espoused by Miggs. But over time, they were gradually won over. And, the generations of doctors that Mutter inspired, and I detail a lot of them in Dr. Mutter's Marvels in the chapter about his legacies, are incredible. We still benefit to this day by the work that Dr. Mutter inspired through his students.
Well, we know that the medical community historically has been tough to change from time to time. There's not necessarily old school thinking, but certainly innovation, and understandably at times is viewed a little bit askance as kind of, well, is this really another nutcase or is this for real? I'm curious as to, over time, he must have faced some resistance back then.
I mean, sort of the most famous example that I was able to detail in the book was ether anesthesia. Ether anesthesia was discovered as a medical tool in 1846, and he was one of the first doctors to embrace it. He was the first surgeon in Philadelphia to have an ether surgery. It went successfully, of course, but within months, it was banned in hospitals throughout the city. And one would assume, especially with modern eyes, that if the invention of ether anesthesia would be embraced by the surgical community, oh my gosh, we don't have people screaming screaming out in pain, and we don't have to pay men to hold them onto the table during our surgeries. But in reality, there was any number of factors that prevented it from being embraced. The lack of standardized medicine meant that jars of ethers were wildly unstable. You didn't know how much or how little to use that wouldn't harm the patient or cause them to wake up mid-surgery. You had surgeons whose entire careers were based on performing surgeries on patients who were alive, and they found it unnerving to perform on an unconscious patient, fearing that they would bleed out without them being able to talk to them and let them know how they were doing. And then you had essentially the germ theory not being proven. The rate of death among people who had ether surgeries versus non-ether surgeries were exactly the same, because it wasn't the surgeries themselves that were killing the patients. It was infections afterwards. So until all of those kinks were worked out, it was a really hard road for ether anesthesia to be widely embraced by the medical community, which was shocking to me. And again, you had tons of stories like that of sort of things we've taken granted for in modern ages that people who had to fight upstream to get them accepted is pretty incredible. And I love doing the research for that for Dr. Mutter's Marvels. And I hope people are sort of shocked and awed by that in the same way that I was in reading the book.
Cristin, when did the work that he did, the research that he did, the results that he started to show, and all of the experiential things, when did that start to sort of work its way into medical schools and into medical thought?
It would take the later half of the 19th century. A lot of the tools that we use today were invented in the late 19th century. So he did not live long enough to see his ideas be proven true. Things like germ theory, washing your hands and sterilizing tools prior to surgery, that wouldn't be proven until the modern microscope was invented in the 1890s, which was 3 decades after he died. So it's sort of a tragedy that he didn't get to live long enough to enjoy the rewards of being so forward thinking. But luckily, this book, I think, will help re-illuminate his legacy and make people deeply appreciate the hard work he did decades before his theories could be proven true. I'm
curious also about any relationships or connections or communications you've had with his descendants and family. How have they been?
Mutter's entire family died when he was a child, so he has no siblings to give birth to nieces or nephews, and he himself was childless. So there was no living descendants of Mutter. In fact, the Mutter name, the Mutter with an umlaut over it, Mutter added the umlaut to be extra fancy when he returned from studying medicine in Paris, is the only known people. Him and his wife are the only known people to have that last name in the history of America. So, but the Mutter Museum itself is extremely proud of the book. They are sort of the physical legacy of Mutter. And there's always signed copies in the gift shop whenever I travel through Philadelphia. And they've had big launch parties both for the hardcover and the paperback there. So I'm really happy that the book met the expectations and even exceeded them. To be on the New York Times bestseller list for 3 months was more than either of us had ever hoped for this book with the creation of this book. So I'm really happy with it, and I'm so proud to be touring behind the paperback copy of it this month.
Well, her name is Cristin O'Keefe Aptowitz, and she's a poet, probably in her heart and by trade, having, of course, if you worked at CBGB's and you did a guided tour through 20 years of New York City Poetry Slam, we know where the heart is, but she's done some wonderful new work. Umlaut or not, Dr. Mutter's Marvels, a true tale of intrigue and innovation at the dawn of modern medicine, an extraordinary work about an extraordinary guy and an extraordinary place, the museum. And Cristin, how about, can you share with our Lewis at Large listeners, how can they not only get a copy of the book, but find out a little bit more about the work that you do?
Sure. I'm going to be on tour for the next 7 weeks, so feel free to catch me at any of my tour dates, which you can find at aptowitz.com. That's my last name, so it's A-P as in Peter, T as in Tom, O-W-I-C as in cat, Z as in zebra.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at C-O-Aptowitz.
Okay.
And the book can be found at any bookstore. They also have ebooks available for sale for digital downloaders.
Okay. So this begs the question, what's your next work?
we waited until this book came out. My next idea is also historical nonfiction, and it is pretty gory, but it is, the proposal is being put together out right now, so I don't want to spoil it for you, but I will be announcing, what the next book is very shortly on Twitter and on my website, so tune into that.
All right. Well, we would love to have you on again. Best of luck with the book. I know it's already been a success, but it's an interesting story indeed, and I will talk to you soon.
Thank you, Warner. Have a great day.
You bet. We'll be back with more right after this on Lewis at Large.